You can get the impression that Donald Trump is all powerful. He is not. He doesn't want the stock markets to go down. They are plunging precipitously.
I think from everything that we've seen and heard from Trump and some of those around Trump, he is deeply motivated by 19th century impulses of American greatness.
If the tariffs moves falls apart and he has to retreat, I think that shares in Donald Trump will plummet faster than the Dow Jones is plummeting right now.
Good afternoon from New York. We're coming on the air with breaking news about an exceptionally brutal day on Wall Street. President Trump's tariffs sparking a huge sell-off today, sending all three major markets plunging. The trading day there, you're hearing the bell ringing. It's closing. The free fall comes after the president's announcement yesterday to slap reciprocal tariffs on global trading partners. Let's look at the final numbers now on Wall Street. The Dow losing almost a little.
Welcome to a special question and answer edition of the News Agents, which, as you're going to see, is going to be dedicated to the truly seismic events of the past couple of days on Donald Trump's announcement of global tariffs, which is causing global turmoil. And we start with a question from Anna. The stock markets are collapsing and there's all this talk of recession. How worried should we really be?
Well, I think this is the central question, isn't it? I mean, as we're recording this just after 1 o'clock on Friday, we saw real stock market volatility post-tariff announcements on Wednesday night. No coincidence at all, of course, that Trump decided to announce it after the stock markets had closed for precisely that reason. Thursday, volatility. Friday, even worse. We're seeing tech stocks in particular go down the tube. We're seeing the FTSE in London open 4 to 5% down. Suspect the same thing will happen in the US. Brent crude oil down to $60 a barrel. That's pre-Ukraine war territory. And oil prices are a very good indicator usually of where the markets think the overall economy is going to go. Because if you think there's going to be lower activity and you think there's going to be a recession, then the oil price goes down. Gold, meanwhile, through the roof again. Again, another great indicator of where the markets think things are going to go, because things like gold are great holders of value, and it's where you put your money in a safe asset like that. So, yeah, I think we should be worried.
And people say that the markets are not the economy, that the real economy is entirely independent of kind of the gambling casino capitalism of what is happening on a stock market or not. But it becomes the reality of the economy as stocks start to fall, as people lose confidence in the economy. And the biggest bank in the world, JP Morgan, is now saying a 60% chance of recession in the US. Remember, in November, when the presidential election took place, the US economy was humming. Growth was strong. Inflation was coming down. All the talk was of the soft landing for the US economy, and it would be leading everyone else. And now, self-inflicted, decided by Donald Trump himself, not forced on him out of any urgent need to react, there is now talk of serious recession. And I guess the question is, does the rest of the world follow?
And just to tease that out a second, the big question for me, and we talked a little bit about this on Thursday's show, the big question for me is the extent to which this imposition of tariffs could mirror historical examples of what has happened when substantial tariffs have been introduced. And obviously, the comparison that everyone reaches for, and the one that haunts us and that looms largest, is of course the 1930s and the Great Depression. Tariffs didn't cause the Great Depression, but they certainly made it worse, and they cemented it and deepened it. And the question is the extent to which the global economy obviously is very different than it was in the 1930s. It is possible that it is more resilient, that it is better able to cope with the imposition of tariffs. The US is a smaller percentage of the world economy than it was in the 1930s. But it's possible, of course, it could be even worse. Why? The world was quite globalized, actually, in the 1920s and 30s. Not as much as it was at the start of the 20th century, but it was relatively globalized. It's way more globalized now. We've gone through an 8-decade process of more or less the world, economically speaking, contracting, of supply chains getting shorter, and outsourcing across the world. And let me just give you a very quick example of that, John. There was a report that was published just a few minutes ago as we were sat here from a tech analyst. They're saying that iPhones could rise in price from $1,000 to $3,500 because of the imposition of tariffs, the retaliatory tariffs that we're seeing from China in response to what happened with Trump. And of course, why does that matter? Why does that happen? Because as a result of that economic globalization, that economic shrinkage, if you like, throughout the world, many of the components of iPhones and tech are manufactured in China. They're American companies based in California, Apple, Texas, all this sort of stuff, but they're manufactured in China. Just imagine what would happen. That's just iPhones. Think of that replicated across the entire economy and what that could do to consumer confidence and the model of consumer capitalism as we've come to know it.
You know, on the news agents, we like to start the introduction with a question. So having had this little discussion, here's the question. Should we believe that Donald Trump is right in his gamble and that generations of politicians, economists, bankers are completely wrong when they say tariffs lead to ruin? Welcome to the News Agents.
The News Agents.
It's John.
It's Lewis.
And after that rather chunky introduction...
Depressing. Buy your iPhones now, folks.
Yeah, exactly. We're all going to hell in a handbasket. Nothing can be done about it unless Donald Trump changes his mind, which, of course, he might. Let's start with this question from Philip in North London. If the Dems win the midterms, could they vote to halt the tariffs?
Wasn't this a question from someone you ran into?
No, it's a genuine question.
No, I know it's a genuine question, but it was put to
it was
someone.
there was someone.
That's how we get our questions. We basically just wander around London and see if anyone talks to us.
Okay, full disclosure. I was walking the dog this morning, and there's a guy I know who also walks his dog, who lives near me.
And he's like, "It's the Oracle, John Sobel. I have a question for you."
He's an economist. He's been an economist of private equity and all sorts, and he knows a hell of a lot more about it than me. But he was kind of asking the political question about could Congress halt this?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question because, I mean, it gets to the heart of things we like on this show, which is constitutional theory. And we've talked on the show this week about one of the reasons Trump likes tariffs is because he, as president, can unilaterally impose them. And he enjoys power, he enjoys wielding the power, he enjoys the theatre of it, the show of it. But actually, technically, the Constitution makes clear that it is Congress that has the power to regulate trade. And historically, Congress would have approved tariffs just as they would with treaties. You know, the Senate has the ability to approve or disapprove of treaties. And so historically, they would have done that. Over time, basically what has happened, and it's basically happened over about a century and a half, over time, Congress has delegated that power to the president and has passed itself various acts of Congress which delegate that power to the president. So theoretically, if there were a majority in the House and in the Senate, they could try and wrest that power back. The problem with that is that Trump would then, as president, probably veto that act. Therefore, you would then need a 2/3 majority in both the Senate and the House to override that presidential veto, which is very unlikely to occur because the Dems just wouldn't win that many seats. If they did, it would probably end up in the Supreme Court. So the answer is basically, theoretically, yes. Practically, probably not.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that since Trump won power again in November, what has been really striking is the extent to which Congress is almost talking itself out of business, as though it's this sort of, you know, kind of showpiece of historical anachronism that has no real power. It's like, you know, in Britain we've got the Privy Council. And what do Privy Councillors actually ever really do?
Congress is actually the most... They're co-equal branches of government. But
Exactly.
Congress is actually the most powerful. It's Article 1. Article 1 of the Constitution.
Yeah.
The reason the founders started with Congress is because they think the Congress is actually the most important branch because it is the only branch that truly represents the whole country.
So when Congress sort of decides, oh yeah, well, I know we've passed all these funds for the Department for Education and for USAID and for whatever other government department, and then Donald Trump says, I'm going to slash those budgets. No, the Congress should have been able to say, you're not doing that. I'm sorry. We pass the budgets. We set what people spend. We deal with all of this stuff. Instead of which, they said, OK, if that's what you want to do, Donald, it's fine. And you wonder, what is the point of the House now?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, the Speaker of the House is the third most senior person in the US Constitution after the President and Vice President. And at the moment, we've got a kind of speakership where they do whatever the White House seems to ask of them.
It is interesting, though, just on the point about could Congress reassert itself. I don't know if you saw this, John, but in the last 24 hours, Chuck Grassley, who is a very senior, very old Republican senator
from Iowa,
Iowa, one of the, I think probably actually the most senior Republican member of the Senate by longevity now, has introduced a bill in the Senate with a Democratic senator which would reassert Congress's power, do precisely what I've just been talking about, would reassert Congress's power to take control or authorize any tariffs the president would want to impose. Now, nothing's going to happen with that bill. It's never going to get out of its committee because there just wouldn't be support for it right now in the Senate. But it is being backed by several other Republican senators. And why would Grassley from Iowa be supporting this? Well, of course, Iowa, very agricultural state, lots of crops, lots of exports to different parts of the world. Real concern among American farmers that agricultural products are usually the first thing to get hit by reciprocal tariffs from other countries. So it is interesting, even within the Republican Party in the Senate, there is discontent, there is unhappiness, particularly from states which have been most affected. We saw it as well from a Republican senator in Maine. Maine, just next to Canada, Maine's being buffeted by the sort of collapse in trade and travel that we're seeing from Canada to Maine and the US more widely. So there is discontent, there is unhappiness. This is still ultimately the party, the Republican Party, which is supposed to be the free trade party, and until quite recently was the free trade party. And that muscle memory is still there, albeit is one that they're not too keen to express too directly.
But there would have to be a hemorrhaging of support for Donald Trump. It would have to go catastrophically wrong. And, you cannot rule that out. Given the way the markets are reacting right now, and, China has now retaliated against the US tariffs and imposed their own 34% supplementary tariffs on US goods, which will guarantee that the US market, when it opens in just over an hour's time, will, I'm sure, plummet. It's possible that there will be a hemorrhaging of support, but we are nowhere near that yet. We're in the foothills of what could be a very long and miserable time ahead of us.
So we have another question here. This is from Linda. There's all this talk about the US midterms. Could Donald Trump suspend them? And just in case you don't know what the midterms are, the midterms are the off-year elections which take place in Congress. They're in the middle part of a presidential term, so the next one will be in November 2026, where all of the House of Representatives is up for election, because it's always up for election every 2 years, and a third of the Senate, 33 of the Senate seats will be up for election. And there'll be gubernatorial elections as well.
I think you are in the land of constitutional crisis.
Yeah.
If for any reason the midterm elections got suspended, and you would really be saying, we are suspending the Constitution. I mean, remember during the Second World War, elections carried on.
America's never missed an
Exactly.
election. Not even during the Civil War when half the country left.
Not even during COVID, when there were all the problems of voting and all the rest of it. There have been various times, various crises that have beset and befallen the United States of America, whether it be war, whether it be a civil war, whether it be COVID, and the elections have gone on. If there are no midterm elections in 2 years' time or 18 months' time, whatever it is, you are talking about really the end of US democracy.
Correct.
And I don't think that's an overstatement.
No, I don't think it is at all. I mean, the sort of constitutional setup is that the president has no constitutional authority to suspend elections. You would need a constitutional amendment to do it, because the Constitution sets out
The dates,
elections.
the timings,
Yeah,
exactly.
Congress does have the power under the Constitution to change the date. So, for example, it's always in early November. If Congress wanted to, it could move it to, say, December, or it could move it earlier. But constitutionally speaking, on, say, let's take the members of the House, on the 3rd of January, when the new House sits, or the new senators sit, if there have been no elections, those old members of the House of Representatives, they lose their seats. Those seats become vacant, whether there has been an election to replace them or not. So if they suspended elections, in legal terms, it isn't as if the old members of the House of Representatives could just keep sitting. Legally speaking, unless there was a constitutional amendment, those seats would fall vacant. You would not have any members of the House of Representatives. Therefore, you could pass no law. So as you say, John, if it did happen, then it would be the end of American democracy. And you know what? I think there's an element sometimes. It's a bit like all this Trump third term stuff. I think we've got it into our heads a little bit that Trump is all powerful, that he just resists and is able to completely resist all political gravity and all political norms and all political rules. And it is true that very often he does. But I think, as you say, America, since the foundation of the Republic, has not missed any single election, even when, as I say, half the country seceded from it. I think ultimately the process of elections, of having elections, is so ingrained in the American Republic that if he were, or there was an attempt to truly try and suspend them, I think you would see civil disobedience. You would see civil disobedience in the streets of the United States. You would end up in something that was probably not full-on civil war, but wasn't far away from it.
There was an election which we talked about on the US edition of the podcast. There was election for a seat on the Supreme Court in Wisconsin, which turned out to be the most expensive judicial seat ever fought, with Elon Musk pouring in millions and millions of dollars into the Republican candidate. Well, yeah, the kind of conservative candidate to be on that court. And the Democrats won it handsomely. It was a Liberal who won the last remaining seat handsomely. And what that kind of proved, and J.D. Vance has spoken about this, is that actually when Trump's name isn't on the ballot, as it won't be in the midterm elections because Trump isn't up for re-election, then the Republicans do pretty badly and the Democrats do better. And so it is perfectly possible that, given how tight the House of Representatives is now, that those 435 seats, when they're up for grabs in November 26, could go Democrat.
Oh, yeah,
may well go Democrat, in which case
probably say
governing
they're
becomes
very
much
likely
more
to.
difficult and problematic for Donald Trump.
Well, yeah, the domestic agenda of Donald Trump will be completely over.
Yes.
And also the House of, if as happened in his first term, if they get control of the House, the Democrats, then obviously they have the power of subpoena. They can start holding hearings. They can start holding inquiries into all sorts of the stuff that's gone on, Doge and all of this sort of stuff. And so they would unearth all manner of things. I suppose the bigger concern in a way about American elections is that, obviously, because I can hear people listening to this probably saying, well, Lewis, you say it would be illegal. John, you say it would be illegal. You say it would be the end of American democracy. Well, look at all the other stuff that's happening right now that's illegal or anti-democratic or backsliding. And that's absolutely true. But of course, a lot of that stuff is sort of unseen. Most people won't notice. Elections are very visible, right? They either happen or they don't. And if they don't happen, it is very visible. I don't think there is any question about the elections themselves happening. Obviously, there is a bigger question in the sort of medium term about how those elections are conducted. And of course, we saw in the election of 2020 the attempt to overturn the result of that election. So it is possible that a rot has set in or will set in, particularly with elements of the Republican Party, where they continue to try and subvert democratic processes, particularly at a local level. So that, of course, is still possible.
Let's go to this question from Sean in Dublin. Love the pod. It's the first place I go to these days to hear breaking stories discussed. My question is, do you believe there is a real chance of the US moving to annex Greenland? And if so, how would Denmark, and more broadly NATO, be likely to respond? I mean, Sean, it is the absolute nightmare scenario for Denmark, which is going through so many circles of hell right now as it tries to make sense of what Donald Trump wants and what he's after and what this really is all about. And I think it would pose a similar nightmare for NATO. I mean, I go back to something that Lewis said a moment ago, that you can get the impression that Donald Trump is all powerful. He is not. He doesn't want the stock markets to go down. They are plunging precipitously. He can't stop that. And I just do not believe that Donald Trump is going to be organising a task force to invade Greenland and take it over.
I sort of go back and forth on this because on any level, it would clearly be absurd. It would obviously be the end of NATO in any meaningful way. I mean,
Yeah.
you've got one member of the alliance
Attacks
invading
another.
another. I mean, I don't think nobody imagined that would even be a possibility, right? It would be the end of NATO. Who would be invoking Article 5? Which side of it? So it would clearly be the end of NATO. It would be the end of the Western Alliance. It would be the end of American leadership of the West. It would be the end of the America as we've known it and the global order as we've known it. We've sort of gingerly got extremely close to that precipice in all sorts of ways, even over the last couple of weeks and last couple of months, but we would be so far beyond it. So it would be momentous. There's no question, I think, that NATO or Europe or whatever would be able to resist it. America has the benefit of already having a base on Greenland that they would be able to use as part of that invasion. And so on one level, I would think it was ridiculous. And yet, I do think Trump genuinely has an eye on his legacy. And I think from everything that we've seen and heard from Trump and some of those around Trump, he is deeply motivated by 19th century impulses of American greatness. In some ways, Trump one reminded me, it was much more a sort of 1950s kind of sort of nostalgia. He wanted to almost be a sort of Eisenhower type sort of figure. Sort of
Rose-tinted lenses of the glorious days of big American cars and the freeway, etc.
Yeah, and a sort of cultural nostalgia
Yeah.
for a type of Americanness. I think now he's much more motivated and interested and articulates, even if he doesn't always do it consciously, with a much more 19th century type of Americana and American thinking, which is about expansion, which is about greatness through expansion. And there are people around him who are more invested in the intellectual history of all of that and the ideas of manifest destiny, which we've talked about before, who are talking quite openly about the idea that America needs to be larger. And what could be more appealing, right? What could be more appealing to the ultimate real estate developer than part of his legacy being the biggest territorial acquisition since the Alaska Purchase, right? I think Trump looks at the map, genuinely. I don't know what you think, John. I think Trump looks at the map, and as always, he has that sort of at once brilliant but also deeply sort of simplistic sort of view about everything. And he just looks at the map, and he looks at Greenland, and he goes, why is that Danish? Where is Denmark? It's nowhere near. It should be ours, right? And that is clearly part of what is motivating him right now.
So I think there are two things about this that I would say. One is that Donald Trump always goes in with the maximalist position. You know, I want every NATO country to be spending 5% of their GDP on defence. And, well, I'll settle for 3. You know, it's a negotiation. And so I want Greenland. Well, okay, if you let us have whatever bases we want and whatever access we want, then maybe we can do a co-ownership deal. We could do a partnership deal. We'll get some of the minerals on there. You get some of the minerals. It's a deal. But, you know, we don't need to fly our US flag. But it's understood that this is, you know, broadly US territory. I think there is a degree of negotiation in what Donald Trump is trying to do vis-a-vis Greenland. The other thing I think, though, and this goes back to where we started this podcast on the state of the economy, I think Donald Trump is gambling absolutely everything. He is betting the house, his whole presidency, on this move on tariffs. If the tariffs move falls apart and he has to retreat, which I think is distinctly possible, and it looks like a total economic failure, I think that shares in Donald Trump will plummet faster than the Dow Jones is plummeting right now. And I think that then Donald Trump is a lame duck president and won't be able to do much at all, because I think he will have squandered all his authority on this massive, massive gamble on what he's doing with global tariffs.
We'll be back with more of your questions right after this. Right, we've got a question here from Sean Donnelly, who says, a reanimated Thatcher wins a snap election. Right, I've got several questions about your question here, Sean. How does she manoeuvre the UK through the current global political landscape? That's a will to power, isn't it?
God,
From beyond the grave, she reanimates, and the first thing she does is stand for election. Mind you, the Tory party would have a back like that.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, that'd be no problem whatsoever.
Completely.
That's probably where we're heading, like AI Thatcher to lead the Tory party. Or maybe like Futurama, where you just have this sort of head in a jar. That'd be
Look,
great.
I think that it's a great question, because, you know, you go back to the Thatcher years. And of course, Thatcher did everything to nurture the relationship with Ronald Reagan. And when people talk about the special relationship, you really do think of Thatcher, Reagan and their incredible closeness. But remember also that Reagan absolutely screwed Britain over with the invasion of Grenada without any word going to Britain beforehand that this was about to take place. And I remember in the Commons, I was a very young political correspondent, and there was Geoffrey Howe making a speech, and Dennis Healey was the shadow foreign secretary, and he said, when America says jump, we say how high. And I think that there are elements of that as well, that I think that Thatcher wouldn't be doing that much different from Keir Starmer. And I kind of think that there is a quiet respect from senior Tories right now at the way Starmer is doing this, that he's keeping calm, he's not raising the temperature, he's playing it cool. But I suppose the other question, Lewis, we've got to speculate on is, what would the Thatcher-Trump relationship be like? The two blondes.
Oh, Donald. Margaret. Well, it's fascinating, isn't it? It is a really, really interesting question because, look, I mean, Thatcher was a deep Atlanticist.
Yeah.
She was sceptical, particularly towards the end. She became very skeptical. One of the reasons she was so sceptical about the EEC, as it then was, the EC, was because of her deep Atlanticism. She had a thought that she had a particular penchant for talking about the kind of freedom of the English-speaking world and all of this sort of stuff. And she loved America, and as you say, she loved Reagan in particular. They were kindred spirits ideologically in all sorts of different ways. Probably as close as it ever got, apart from Blair and Bush. I think with Trump, I think Thatcher was a woman of her age, right? So I think she would find him louche. I think she'd find him vulgar. I think she'd find him unpredictable. I think she would abhor his views about NATO. She would absolutely
abhor his views about Russia as well.
Abhor his views about Russia, yes, because she was, deeply, I mean, obviously she was a Cold War warrior in so many ways. She had respect for someone like Mikhail Gorbachev, but loathed the USSR. She would loathe Putin. She would have loathed what has happened with Ukraine. She was always someone very fond of a World War II metaphor or lens of seeing the world through World War II, and I'm no doubt she would have seen it in that way. So I think she would be very, very concerned about his relationship with Russia, Ukraine, and NATO. That said, I suspect she would have admired the fact that he was a businessman. She would have there would be an element to her that probably, but despite herself, found him quite charming, and certainly ideologically they would probably be aligned on a number of different things. But as you say, I think ultimately, as ever with the U.S.-U.K. relationship, personalities matter, but it's the strategic imperatives which govern. And as you say, I can't really think of a British Prime Minister who would be handling it much differently to Starmer, which I think tells you a lot about the importance of geopolitical reality versus individual temperament and character.
And we also talk so much about how politicians are influenced by the media coverage that they get and then kind of will adjust their policy to get a favourable headline or whatever. And, there's a lot of kind of savagery around Starmer at the moment about being so supine towards Trump, and why doesn't he show a pair? Why doesn't he grow a pair? Why doesn't he show
it and grow it?
Show it and grow it. And the fact of the matter is that I think that Starmer is absolutely convinced that what he's doing is the right way. It's the only way. It's in Britain's national interests that he pursue a softly approach and do the talking behind the scenes and not be performative in front of the cameras. He's not taking a Canadian approach, although, Mark Carney has an election to fight in Canada, and that's why he's probably doing it slightly differently. And I think that there would be a consistency, whether it be Thatcher or whether it be Reagan. Also, whether it be Thatcher or whether it be Keir Starmer. Just one other thing on the Thatcher-Reagan. I mean, at the time when Reagan was the president, he was kind of seen in similarly dim light by a lot of kind of, educated intelligentsia in the West as Trump is now. There was a sneer towards Ronald Reagan that he was the B-list Hollywood actor who was a bit thick and didn't really know what he was doing.
But he had been governor of California.
Yeah, he had been. I know. He had been, and he'd won elected office, and he'd been also involved in, kind of union battles as well from his time kind of with airlines.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, Thatcher and Reagan were both deep ideologues. They had both actually moved to the right over the course of their careers. I mean, Reagan started out as a Democrat. And they both in their own way sort of found religion in the sense of a deep intellectual conviction of conservatism and the failures of the kind of post-war settlement in both of their countries, and that's how they became kind of kindred spirits. I think we've got since we're talking about Thatcher Reagan, we should play the clip. Of Thatcher. This alludes to what John was just talking about. The invasion of Grenada in 1983. Cut long, very, very long story short, there'd been a coup in Grenada. Reagan decides to send in the American military to remove this new government. The only hitch being that Grenada was part of the Commonwealth. The Queen, the late Queen, was the head of state, and they had not informed the British government, or indeed, as a result, the royal family, that this invasion was going to take place. And there was a very awkward phone call. Actually, not that awkward. It's just really revealing about their exchanges between the two characters. There was a phone call made by Reagan to Thatcher to apologise for what had happened. And this clip, kept up, and this record kept by the White House and released by the Reagan Presidential Library a couple of years ago is just delicious.
Hello, Margaret Thatcher, yes?
If I were there, Margaret, I'd throw my hat in the door before I came in. We regret very much the embarrassment that's been caused you, and I'd just like to tell you what the story is from our end out here. When your word came of your concerns, by the time I got it, the 0 hour had passed, and our forces were on their way. And, of course, the time difference made that it was later in the day when you learned of it, and for us over here it was only 5:30 in the morning when the They finally landed, and at last we could talk plainly.
Well, there's a lot of work to do yet, Ron, still, isn't there?
Oh, yes. Yeah, and
it'll be very tricky.
we think that the military part of it is going to end very shortly. But as I say, I'm sorry for any embarrassment we caused you, but please understand it was just our fear of our own weakness over here with regard to secrecy.
It's very kind of you to have rung, Ron.
Well, my pleasure.
Appreciate it. How is Nancy?
Just fine.
Good. Give her my love.
I shall. All right.
Thank you very much. I must return to this debate in the House. It's a bit tricky.
Oh, all right.
Yes.
Go get him. Eat him alive.
Goodbye.
All right, bye.
Delicious.
Give my love to Nancy.
Honestly, can we have the start? Hello, Mr. President Donald.
Give my love to Victoria.
Yeah, exactly. I'm
Love
sure he
that
would
girl.
love to. I'm sure he
Yes,
would
I'm
love to. Right.
Give
let
my
us go.
love to Melania.
This is from Paul, and it's such a good question. I was due to attend a friend's wedding in North Carolina. The trip's obviously been booked for a while, since well before the election. However, we've been watching with increasing alarm the rapidly unfolding events. We have since decided to cancel our trip for peace of mind, obviously feeling guilty not to attend the wedding. How much, as Europeans, do we need to worry about problems trying to enter the US? Would you advise against all but essential travel, or is that too alarmist? Well, I would say it's too alarmist to say we can't go anywhere near America for the next 4 years. There are many countries I would feel very sceptical about visiting for the next 4 years.
Yeah.
America is not one of them. But I do understand that there is a wariness about going to America, which I say this as someone who absolutely loves the country.
Yeah.
It is one of the most beautiful countries to travel in. The national parks, amazing people. The national parks are fabulous. People are polite, gracious, welcoming, and yet there is a kind of feeling of America at the moment. I saw some figures that flights from Canada to the US, passengers flights, are down 70-75% on this time last year. Because Canadians do not want to go. They feel so cross with America right now. They don't want to go there. And that is going to have a real effect on the tourism industry.
You know, I'm going to use a football metaphor, John. You're going to be
Wow.
really impressed with me.
Oh, I want to see.
Trump is basically being Millwall, isn't he?
Yeah.
You know, everybody hates us. We don't care.
Yeah.
And that is it. And that is basically the kind of, we'll keep saying it all week. To me, this is the great test, right? It's the great test of this second Trump presidency, is the extent to which is America as powerful as Trump thinks it is, and as powerful as he thinks he is, because he basically believes that it doesn't really matter if he pisses off all of his friends and America's allies. It doesn't really matter if he rips up American political leadership in the world, all the institutions that America has built. It doesn't really matter if he rips up all the American economic leadership in the world over 8 decades and the economic institutions he's built, because America is just powerful enough to withstand all of it. Market fluctuations, friends abandoning it, reordering of alliances, doesn't matter. Now, my view is that actually America is not as powerful as he thinks it is, despite the fact it is very powerful, that no country is an island, right? Even the United States. Well, apart from the countries which are islands like us, but you know what I mean. He is basically pushing that theory to destruction. But to answer that question like really directly, I don't think anybody should not go to the United States, particularly for family things like that, because of worries about politics. I can understand it, and I can understand, you know, obviously, particularly with some of the stuff we're hearing about, you know, ICE and the border, border agents and all these sorts of people, and it does. This is what's so damaging about this whole thing. When a country which has had the rule of law at its core and centre for so long starts to undermine that impression about itself, and you start getting people wondering, actually, am I going to get a tap on the shoulder from somebody? Highly, highly unlikely. But the very fact you even start thinking about that is so corrosive and so disturbing. But the truth is, I think you just got to think America, in my heart of hearts, I do think, and maybe this is just, I don't know what you think about this, John. Maybe I'm just being Panglossian, maybe I'm just being optimistic or romantic and sentimental. I think America will survive what is happening now. I think American democracy will just about survive what is happening now. I think American leadership in the world will change. But I think that, you know, electoral cycles are quicker than you think. And you've already alluded to it as well. Donald Trump, even by the time we're sat here this time next week, politically could look very, very different to where he's been for the last few months. Partly because he is testing that theory of his own power to destruction. He is stretching and stretching and stretching the elasticity of his own power. And I think that elastic could well be about to snap back.
One of the things that has changed so profoundly over 8 years is 8 years ago, Donald Trump was surrounded by people saying, "You must be bloody joking. Don't be so frigging
Probably
stupid."
too many people in some
Yeah,
ways.
possibly too many people. There were too many grown-ups in the room saying, "Oh my God, Donald, come on, knock it off." And now he's just surrounded by people who are going, yeah, go for it. Yeah, 20%, make it 25% tariffs.
Yeah,
China, just pile them up.
He's drunk his own Kool-Aid. And so is everybody around him. That he's some sort of a figure who is so titanic that he can just move beyond all laws of political and economic gravity. And actually, as we said at the start, in fairness, compared to most political figures, he does. But even he is not invulnerable.
I mean, Canute-like, he cannot stop the waves coming in.
Don't call me Canute. How dare you, John? Right, one more. Will J.D. Vance, is from Andrew Simon from West Cork. Will J.D. Vance, if he succeeds Trump, do a Khrushchev and denounce his predecessor? This is so interesting, isn't it? This is so, because it basically alludes to what do we think the J.D. Vance's strategy is? What's his game? Because there are two broad scenarios, right? It seems to me. One is that Vance has drunk the Kool-Aid, that he's actually really transformed.
He's a convert.
Yeah, he's a convert, exactly. Yeah. He's got the zeal of the convert. Someone who historically actually said he was not a Trump person, who criticised Trump very readily, thought he was basically taking the piss out of the sort of people he cared about, sort of the, traditional white voters in Appalachia, the sort of, and the Midwest sort of place that he's from. But now he obviously says trying on every single opportunity to out-Trump Trump in order to get the nomination. Is he doing that because he really believes it? Or is he playing a more subtle game? Is he doing, dare I say it, a more extreme version of what Keir Starmer did?
Yeah.
And that's not to throw shade particularly on Starmer. Political history is littered with examples of leaders who have sussed out where the centre
how to win the leadership.
Yeah, where the centre of politics of their party is. Even if they don't believe it, move there, stay there until you get that leadership, and then you play a longer game to move it away from that place. Is he playing a game where actually, in his own head, because there's a world where this is true, right? There's a world where he might be like, I'm going to take every indignity and do whatever is necessary to get the leadership of this party so I can save this party and save this country. Because if I don't do it, then who knows who will take over. I think that's probably quite an optimistic view and a rosy view of J.D. Vance, but it's possible, right?
Okay, I'm going to give the slightly less rosy optimistic view, which is that I think that he has got the zeal of the convert. And he also knows that all the levers of control of the Republican Party now are MAGA.
Yeah.
And therefore, that is not going to change in 3 or 4 years' time. Donald Trump may have left the stage, however, by whatever means. But the people like Don Jr. and all those other people are still there, still demanding the populism. These people hold all the power in the party. And I think J.D. Vance will be running very much as a Trump, mini-me, maybe with a bit more intellect, maybe with a bit more kind of control, maybe with a bit more discipline. Although, does he galvanise the voters to go out and vote in the numbers that Donald Trump did?
I suppose as well, in fairness, we sometimes talk about these things as if they're just an issue of political personality, right? The truth is, partly because of Trump, some of these trends were happening anyway. The Republican Party is just very different. Its coalition has transformed in 3 or 4 election cycles, right? It used to be basically what the Democratic Party is now, the party of highly educated, wealthy voters, on the right, more free trade, whatever. The sort of classic country club Republican, right? Today, the country club Republican is the sort of Mar-a-Lago Republican, right? And also that alliance with, poorer, white, often unionized voters, increasingly also poorer black voters and Hispanic voters as well, right? You couldn't get a kind of traditional, or it would be unlikely that you would get a traditional Republican type candidate emerge into that coalition because the coalition has just completely transformed. So the future of the Republican Party, seems to me inevitably, is much more MAGA than anything that came before.
We'll be back in just a moment. Final question before we go, and this is from Seb. If the UK government or the US administration were a Netflix series, what would this current season be called? And are we headed for cancellation or renewal?
The UK could be The Walking Dead. What
about Slow and Cautious Horses?
House of no, that's very unfair. I don't mean that. It's just a joke. I suppose we can do with the US. Ultimately, it'll be Succession.
Yeah,
on the basis of JD Vance.
it's going to be Succession, or it could be Severance from reality.
Strangest things.
Orange Lotus.
Orange Lotus. There we go.
Or as our producer has said, POTUS.
Oh, we used to be at the BBC. We'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.